You can hear the dirt hitting the bodies above you. Not your body. Not yet. You're standing at the edge of the pit, watching your brothers in arms disappear beneath waves of earth, their screams turning to muffled cries, then silence. You surrendered an hour ago. The conqueror gave his word. He swore before God that not a single drop of your blood would be shed. You believed him. You had no choice but to believe him. Now you understand the terrible precision of his promise. The soldiers behind you are pushing forward. Your turn is coming, and you realize in these final moments that you've been defeated, not by a sword, but by a man who turned language itself into a weapon. This actually happened, and the man who did it would go on to perfect this kind of calculated horror in ways that still defy comprehension 6 centuries later. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching. Frumit never stops amazing me how a story this dark, from so long ago, can reach every corner of the planet. The city was Sivas, located in what is now central Turkey. The year was 1400, and the world was already whispering his name with a mixture of reverence and dread. Tamerlane, Timur, the Lame, the man we know as Tamerlane. By this point in his career, he had spent 3 decades carving an empire from the ruins of dozens of kingdoms, and his reputation moved faster than his armies. City garrisons from Persia to India knew the stories. They knew what happened to those who resisted him. They also knew what supposedly happened to those who surrendered. But that knowledge wouldn't save them. Sivas was an Ottoman city, defended by somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Armenian Christian soldiers. When Tamerlane's massive army appeared on the horizon, the commanders inside those walls faced an impossible calculation: fight and certainly die, or surrender and possibly live. The siege began, but it was perfunctory. Both sides understood how this would end. Tamerlane had brought siege engines, engineers, and tens of thousands of battle-hardened troops. The Armenians had stone walls and dwindling hope. Then the offer came. A messenger arrived under a white flag with words that must have sounded like salvation. "Surrender now," the message read, and Tamerlane gives his solemn oath before witnesses and before God, "Not a single drop of your blood will be shed." In the medieval world, such oaths carried weight. They were binding contracts witnessed by heaven itself. Military commanders who broke such promises risked not just their honor, but their legitimacy. The Armenian garrison held counsel. Some argued it was a trap. Others pointed out that traps didn't require elaborate religious oaths, and besides, what choice did they have? They were outnumbered, outmatched, and out of time. The gates of Sivas opened. 4,000 men walked out and laid down their weapons. They must have felt something like relief in those first moments. They had survived. They had made the smart choice. Then Tamerlane's soldiers surrounded them, and the march began. They were taken outside the city walls to a place where the conqueror's men had been working while the siege dragged on. Not building siege equipment, digging. Massive trenches stretched across the earth, deep and wide, like open graves waiting to be filled. And that's when the Armenian soldiers began to understand. The horror didn't announce itself with trumpets or declarations. It revealed itself slowly in the deliberate organization of Tamerlane's troops, in the way they formed lines, in the mechanical efficiency of what came next. No swords were drawn, no arrows were nocked. Tamerlane had given his word, after all. Instead, the first group of prisoners was pushed toward the edge of the trenches. Some tried to run, some begged, some simply stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. It didn't matter. They were shoved into the pit's living, breathing men falling onto hard earth. then the next group, then the next. The trenches began to fill not with bodies, but with soldiers who could still scream. Only after hundreds of men were packed into those earthen tombs did the shoveling begin. Dirt, tons of it, carted in and poured over the edges like grain into a silo. The men at the bottom were crushed by the weight of those falling on top of them. The ones higher up watched the earth rise past their legs, their waists, their chests. Some died within minutes, suffocating as dirt filled their mouths and noses. Others, trapped in small pockets of air, lasted longer, minutes, maybe an hour, buried alive in absolute darkness, feeling the crushing weight, hearing muffled screams all around them, slowly running out of oxygen. 4,000 men died this way, and when it was over, Tamerlane could stand before any court, any council, any religious authority, and speak a simple truth. He had kept his word. Not a single drop of blood had been shed. The brilliance, if we can use such a grotesque word for something so monstrous, wasn't in the cruelty alone. It was in what it communicated. This was a message written in suffocated bodies and sent rippling across every kingdom within 1,000 miles. The message was simple. Tamerlane is always thinking 3 moves ahead of you. Your surrender means nothing. His mercy is a legal trap. And if you think you can predict his methods, you're already dead. But here's what's truly terrifying about Sivas. It wasn't an act of rage. It wasn't revenge for some personal slight. It was calculated theater. Tamerlane didn't need to kill those men at all. They had surrendered. They posed no threat. But he needed every other garrison, every other city, every other commander in his path to hear this story and make their calculations. Some would surrender faster. Some would fight harder, knowing surrender offered no safety. Either way, Tamerlane won. Because he wasn't just conquering territory, he was conquering the human capacity to hope. The medieval chronicler Ibn Arabsha wrote that the screams from those pits could be heard inside the city walls for hours. He noted that the civilians of Sivas, who had been spared, were forced to listen to their defenders die in the most unimaginable way. This was intentional. Tamerlane wanted them to know. He wanted the memory burned into their minds so they would tell their children, who would tell their children, who would carry the story forward as a warning. And it worked. For years afterward, city after city surrendered to Tamerlane without resistance. His reputation became his most effective weapon, but reputation requires maintenance, and Tamerlane understood this like few conquerors in history. Which brings us to the second act, one that would make Sivas look almost restrained by comparison. By 1401, Tamerlane was in his mid-60s, ancient for his time. He had already conquered most of Central Asia and Persia. He had humiliated the Ottoman Sultan. He had sacked Delhi and returned with 90 captured war elephants as trophies. He should have been satisfied. He wasn't, because the city of Baghdad, the legendary capital of Islamic civilization, had done something unforgivable. It had submitted to him once before, accepted his rule, paid tribute. Then, when he left to campaign elsewhere, Baghdad's former sultan managed to retake the city. When word reached Tamerlane, he didn't just see military setback, he saw personal betrayal. Baghdad had a long memory. For 5 centuries it had been the jewel of the Islamic world, the city of scholars and poets, of libraries and astronomical observatories. By 1401, it had declined from its golden age, but it was still a place of immense wealth and cultural significance. The people of Baghdad knew who was coming. They'd heard about Sivas. They'd heard about all of it. But their walls were strong, and they had rallied behind their returned sultan. They would make a stand. The siege lasted 40 days. Tamerlane's engineers worked systematically, undermining walls, positioning siege towers, cutting supply lines. The defenders fought with the desperation of people who knew no mercy would come. They were right. When the walls finally fell, Tamerlane gave an order that would turn his army into a machine of industrial-scale slaughter. Every soldier, from the highest officer to the newest recruit, was given a quota. Each man had to return with a minimum of 2 severed heads, not 1. 2. This wasn't about punishment anymore. This was about creating a system, a bureaucracy of death, because that order transformed everything. It turned massacre into competition. It meant soldiers couldn't be selective. Combatants, civilians, elderly, children, the quota didn't distinguish. You needed heads, and you needed them quickly, because if you failed to meet your quota, you would answer to commanders who served a man who buried thousands alive for entertainment. The soldiers of Tamerlane's army spread through Baghdad like a plague. They moved street by street, house by house. Families hiding in wells were dragged out. People who had concealed themselves in attics, in crypts, behind false walls, all of them, found the killing took on a frenzied quality because it wasn't about territory or treasure. It was about meeting your quota. Some soldiers, according to contemporary accounts, killed captives they had planned to sell as slaves. Valuable property destroyed just to make the count. The chroniclers claimed the death toll reached anywhere from 20,000 to 90,000. The exact number is lost to history, disputed by scholars, impossible to verify with certainty. But here's what we know for certain. When it was over, Tamerlane ordered the heads collected. All of them, tens of thousands of severed human heads, piled in central locations throughout the city. The stench must have been unbearable. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they darkened the air. And then came the construction. Tamerlane's men built towers, not monuments carved from stone, but pyramids assembled from human skulls, carefully stacked, mixed with mortar to hold them together. Some sources claim there were 120 of these towers scattered throughout Baghdad. Modern historians think that number is inflated, but even if we assume half that many, we're still talking about dozens of structures, each one representing hundreds or thousands of people who had been alive just days earlier. These weren't hidden in some remote location. They were placed at major intersections, at city gates, in public squares. Tamerlane wanted them seen. He wanted every traveler, every merchant, every pilgrim passing through Baghdad to witness what happened when you defied him. One chronicler tried to count them all and made it to 28 before he physically couldn't continue. He wrote that the sight and smell made him violently ill, that his hands shook so badly he couldn't hold his pen. This was a man who had witnessed medieval warfare, who had seen executions and battlefield carnage, and the skull towers of Baghdad broke him. The towers stood for years. Some sources say decades, slowly weathering, gradually collapsing, but present. A constant reminder that Tamerlane's reach extended beyond his lifetime. Parents would walk past them holding their children's hands, and you have to wonder what they told them. How do you explain that? How do you tell a child that each skull in that tower was a person, with a name, a family, dreams, fears, and a life that ended because of a quota system? But Tamerlane wasn't finished. He ordered the destruction of Baghdad's great public buildings. Libraries containing manuscripts that had survived centuries were burned. The accumulated knowledge of generations turned to ash. Palaces were torn down, stone by stone. The physical infrastructure of one of history's greatest cities was systematically dismantled. Interestingly, he spared the mosques and religious shrines, not out of piety, but strategy. He wanted everyone to see that this wasn't about religion. This was about obedience. The mosques stood like lonely lighthouses in a sea of ruins, emphasizing the message: God's houses remain. Everything else is negotiable. Baghdad never fully recovered. The survivors fled into the countryside. The economy collapsed. The cultural legacy, built over 5 centuries, was shattered in 5 days. And the skull towers stood as architectural proof of what one man's calculated brutality could achieve when applied with enough intelligence and systematic precision. Here's what makes these two acts particularly horrifying when you put them side by side. They represent two different approaches to the same goal: breaking the human spirit. Sivas was intimate, legalistic, almost philosophical in its cruelty. 4,000 men dying slowly underground because of a technicality and a promise. Baghdad was industrial, bureaucratic, mechanized. Tens of thousands killed to feed a quota system, their remains repurposed into monuments. One was a scalpel, the other was a sledgehammer. Both were designed by the same mind. Tamerlane died in 1405, just 4 years after Baghdad, while planning an invasion of China. His empire, built on terror and held together by fear of his personal presence, fractured within decades. His descendants fought each other. His territories split apart and were absorbed by other powers. The vast domain he'd created through such calculated horror didn't even survive a generation intact, but his methods did. His reputation did. The stories did. 620 years later, we're still talking about the man who buried soldiers alive to keep a promise and built towers from human heads to enforce a quota. The skull towers eventually crumbled. The trenches of Sivas were eventually filled in and built over, but the memory survived, passed down through chronicles, histories, and now digital recordings that will outlast any stone monument. In a strange way, Tamerlane won. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to echo across centuries as a warning. He achieved immortality through horror. There's a detail that historians often mention but rarely dwell on. When Tamerlane died, they embalmed his body and eventually entombed it in a magnificent mausoleum in Samarkand. In 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened his tomb. There's a legend that they found an inscription warning that disturbing his remains would unleash terrible war upon the world. 3 days later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, beginning the deadliest military campaign in human history. It's almost certainly coincidence. But the fact that people still tell that story, still connect Tamerlane's name to catastrophe 6 centuries after his death, tells you everything about the shadow he cast. He understood something profound and terrible about human nature. We remember the monsters. We forget the builders, the poets, the administrators who kept empires running. But we never forget the man who made us look into the abyss. The earth that filled those trenches in Sivas is still there, somewhere beneath modern buildings and paved roads. The ground where Baghdad's skull towers stood has been built over, excavated, repurposed 100 times. But the horror doesn't need physical markers to survive. It lives in the historical record, in the careful documentation of witnesses who couldn't look away, in the way we still can't look away even now. That's Tamerlane's true monument, not the mausoleum in Samarkand, not the empire that vanished, but the understanding that human cruelty, when applied with enough intelligence and creativity, can echo across centuries. The buried soldiers of Sivas are still screaming in the historical record. The skull towers of Baghdad are still standing in our collective memory. And 600 years later, we're still trying to understand how one man could turn horror into art, death into architecture, and suffering into a legacy that will never die.